Okay, welcome everybody. This is a webinar organized by Mennonite Mission Network and the Brooklyn Peace Center, Peace Church. We thought of this webinar in our last leadership meeting with the Brooklyn Peace Church group. I explained a little bit about, I will introduce the presenters, then explain a little bit about the background of this new church plant, new peace center. Leonard Doe, he works for Everance, and he's well known for the Oxford Circle, a church community. You've been there for 20 years, right? So now Leonard works for Everance since 2017, and Leonard is a great resource for us in things related to not only to finances, but also to the structure of the new Peace Church, a new center, a new community center in New York. So he's part of our leadership team. He has 3 children, lives in Philadelphia. Then we have Ruth Wenger. Ruth, she lived in New York since 1971. She's probably the person with more history in New York than any of us. And Ruth, she has been in different roles. She was pastor there for the Manhattan Mennonite Church Fellowship. She also is, now she's the overseer, no, not overseer, the, how do you call it? Conference
minister.
Conference minister for the New York Council of Churches. She lives in the Bronx. She loves New York. She has a passion for the city. She lives there with her husband and enjoying grandchildren at this stage of her life. And Jason Starbaken, he's the pastor of Manhattan Mennonite Fellowship. I met him through Sylvia Schrick, the former conference minister from New York that moved to Portland, Oregon, last December. Right on time. After she moved, the virus came in. Yeah, it's been a pleasure to meet Jason, his wife Bonetta. They live in Brooklyn. They have 2 children. They also have been leaders instrumental in starting a community, radical discipleship community called Radical Living. That at this point they sponsor programs for youth, urban youth, and environmental issues related to the education of these youth. So we're going to share today a little bit about how this Brooklyn Peace Church is emerging in the middle of all this pandemia and all the difficulties we are all facing. But particularly New York, is we all know that it's been hit really hard. But a little bit of background. In July 2019, we got word at the Mennonite Mission Network in our church relations team through Marisa Schmacker, one of our team members, that a Hispanic church in Brooklyn, the Primera Iglesia Mennonita de Brooklyn, was celebrating their 60th birthday. So the church was started in 1959 by a leadership from Mennonite, Board of Missions, and some Dominican, and you correct me, Ruth, later.
Puerto Rican.
Puerto Rican
Yeah.
leaders. So the idea was to spend time with them. I went there as a representative of Mennonite Mission Network, but particularly trying to work with this church on the future of the church, because the church was basically really in bad shape. I mean, there were only 9 to 8 people. So when I got there, we had the celebrations, and what I met there was a nice group of people from different backgrounds. I met Sylvia, Ruth, several Hispanic folks, and also Jason and Bonetta. But one of the things that they asked me after this celebration, this visit, was to work with this group in seeing, the possibility of either continuing with the group or ending, closing this congregation. So after a lot of conversations with Atlantic Coast Conference and leaders from that area, we kind of came to the point in which we decided that the way things were kind of set and the history of this small group, they needed some sort of transitioning. So we saw that this kind of particular group was not sustainable anymore. So we started to think about, particularly the leaders from there. I mean, Sylvia, Jason, and others were saying, what about, the possibility of using this old building? The church was functioning in an old building that was formerly a synagogue. And there were other groups using this building, MCC and a Garifuna group. And they were asking, what if we dream of a ministry here with racial diversity and an emphasis on peacemaking for the city. So we started to work with the conference. Merv Stolfus is the conference minister. We went through a lot of conversations. We came to the conclusion that the goal that we could work with was replanting a church or restarting something new. So we went through all this process in conversations with also with Evans, with Lerner, and with others. And we formed a leadership group. And out of that leadership group, we started to process this dream of planting a peace church and a peace center. Then Jason and Bonetta, they started to put a lot of energy into this, a lot of time. They also started to gather a group of people that are attracted to the idea of having a peace center and a peace church in Brooklyn. Then we started to work with all kind of structural issues related to the stewardship of the building, an old building, all kind of liability issues. There were, several things that were kind of complicated related to the building. So there were like two components, developing a new group, a new peace church, a new peace center, but also dealing with the building, the people that were still using the building. So this was kind of a unique project for me, because normally you start new churches without buildings. And sometimes buildings become a problem for the new church. But that's how we got this wonderful group of people that are going to share now with you guys, involved with the Brooklyn Peace Center, Brooklyn Peace Church. First, we're going to hear from Ruth. She's the conference minister in that region. For those who are not familiar with the Mennonite Church USA system, the conference minister is like a pastor of pastors, or pastor of churches. She's going to share a little bit about New York, the vision for a peace center, and the learnings that she has accumulated all these years doing ministry in New York City. So Ruth, it's your time.
Okay, thank you, Mauricio, and thank you for that excellent summary of what's been happening around the Brooklyn Peace Center and the Brooklyn Peace Church. I just need to tweak a bit of the information that you shared about me in the beginning. I hope you don't mind. I'm pastor of North Bronx Mennonite Church in the Bronx, and I've been pastor there for about 25 years. And unfortunately, sadly, my husband is no longer sharing grandchildren with me. He died in September of 2018. So I'm very grateful to have a 4-year-old grandson who lives upstairs with my daughter and her husband, and we are not quarantined from each other, and we are not sick. I am Atlantic Coast Conference minister for the Atlantic Coast Conference churches in New York City. I'm going to talk a bit about those churches in general as I've known them over the past 50 years, but also to give a bit of deep background because Peace churches in New York City have a long, long record here. And I won't take a long time to do this. There's a really great book about the New York City Mennonite churches available that has a lot more information than we have time to look at now. But there have been Anabaptists, Quakers, and other peace churches in New York City since its very beginning as a Dutch colony. And we were already pointed out as being dissidents by the then governor, Peter Stuyvesant, who was Dutch Reformed. And there was religious intolerance practiced back then. And a document called the Flushing Remonstrance was developed by Quaker and other peace churches, resisting this persecution, if you will, of other churches than the Dutch Reformed. And that document has apparently been the basis for the first amendment to our Constitution, which calls for religious tolerance. So peace churches have a long and deep history here in New York. Anabaptists, Mennonites appear in civil records from 1640 through about 1750. And then there's a long blank time when there's not much record of presence here at all. The very first woman who was ordained as a Mennonite in any Mennonite denomination in North America, Anne Allerbach, in 1893 was ordained and came to the city as a Mennonite, but did not serve in any Mennonite congregation. She served in an Episcopal congregation, but she was a Mennonite and remained Mennonite throughout her ministry. In 1923, Margaret Foth was a missionary from the Midwest. She came here and worked for many years, developing ministries among women, children, many different areas in the city as well, and was here until 1971. She retired as an elderly person and went back to the Midwest. So there's very little continuous history until we come to the 40s. So in 1940, across the Mennonite Church, there was a new interest in mission, and particularly foreign missions. And then some people started saying, well, you know, it seems New York is about as exotic as a foreign place could be, so why don't we look at New York as a mission field? And so folks from Lancaster County started making day trips to New York. Church groups, youth groups would come and distribute the way. That it was a newsletter, sort of, a larger tract than most tracts, a pamphlet about who Jesus is and how Jesus can get involved in our lives and we can respond to Jesus. And some of you may remember that document. It was The Way. It came out maybe every 2 months. I don't really remember that. But they also then started holding some services, some sidewalk services. They weren't formal services or public services, but a number of groups came during the 40s for those purposes. And also there were Mennonites here getting their education. New York Biblical Seminary had a number of Mennonite students. Union Theological Seminary, a number of Mennonite students. People came in CPS to do alternative service, to get an education. And that culminated in the very first public service being held at Fox Street in the South Bronx in 1949. That year I can remember because that's the year I was born, not to give anything away. So my life began about the time of the current development of New York City churches. In the 1950s, the mission boards got interested. So the mission board of the Mennonite Church and Lancaster Mission Board set out to plant churches here with a different mode of operating. They tended to work in economically distressed areas. They ended up in Puerto Rican, in Black communities, and also came with the intention of working with Jewish people. They came from Lancaster Conference, from Ohio and Eastern Conference. That group started the Friendship Community Church, and then the Puerto Rican Conference. And it was the Puerto Rican Conference, actually, out of which First Mennonite Church of Brooklyn was established. That was primarily in the 50s. Also in the 50s, the VS unit on 19th Street was started for people coming here to do voluntary service. That space is now known as Menno House, and it's a transitional or temporary short-term housing community for, it's an intentional community in a way, at least it's an intentional lodging community, and it's a ministry now of Manhattan Mennonite Fellowship. In the 1960s and 70s, a New York City Administrative Council was formed, both to give them more general and focused voice in the churches back home, particularly in Lancaster. And that was, first of all, Lancaster Conference, and then eventually Ohio and Eastern melded with some other groups and became Atlantic Coast Conference. Those two groups were in the New York City Council of Mennonite Churches, as it came to be known, and the Puerto Rican Conference joined the Atlantic Coast Conference also. So in my history with New York City Council of Mennonite Churches, that's been primarily the two conferences, Lancaster and Atlantic Coast Conference. There was a period of time when a Brethren in Christ church was also part of the council, and there had been a conservative Mennonite church plant here also, which eventually left both the council and the conservative conference over various issues. That church, the conservative group, joined the Biblical Mennonite Alliance, and there's now a second church of the Biblical Mennonite Alliance group here in New York. There are also some Haldeman Mennonite congregations, and there's a new one. Some that were formerly Mennonite related, but aren't necessarily describing themselves as Mennonite now. So altogether in New York now, there are between 20 and 25 congregations, depending on how you count them. There are currently about 18 on the New York City Council of Mennonite Churches. I was talking about the 60s and the 70s. There was in the 70s a Christian Education Committee formed, and also in the 70s, Heartsease Home was begun as a ministry for young women between the ages of 16 and 21 who needed to be in foster care, and it was a foster boarding home on East 70th Street in Manhattan. That's when Leonard and I met and worked together on structuring that program. And it was at the Heartsease Home then that a vision for a peace center, which is quite similar in many ways to the Brooklyn Peace Center's vision, was born. And I'll say a bit more about that. In the 1980s, there was a peace center formed out of interest in a new call to peacemaking seminar that was held here in New York. And my husband was on that committee. He had attended that seminar, and some other New Yorkers as well, some from Manhattan Mennonite Fellowship. There was a peace center with an office in the Bronx and a staff person that consisted primarily of doing outreach in congregations, of sharing the message of peace, directing people to alternatives to military service, and so on. Sylvia Horst was the staff person for that program. And somehow that it morphed several times. There was also an Anabaptist Peace Library that was housed for a while at Manhattan Mennonite Fellowship. That is no longer there. So there have been initiatives toward peace almost from the beginning of the work here in New York. None of them developed as fully as what we hope Brooklyn Peace Center will. There was also some shift in mission emphasis to people group outreach. And so there was an Ethiopian language congregation begun, and also I think there are close to a half dozen, maybe not quite that many, Garifuna congregations functioning here in New York as well. These are all church plants, and what happened in the 80s and 90s is that churches here became well established and started their own church plants here in New York. Earlier, the church planters were drive-in, go-home missionaries, and then there were move-in and eventually go-back-home missionaries. Many of the pastors stayed long enough for another pastor to come in. Eventually, the switch was made over to having nearly all local, born in New York or immigrant to New York from other countries, pastors of churches. So there's been a major shift in who is pastoring the churches in New York and what the leadership looks like. The pastors look like their congregations, unlike what was happening in the 50s and early 60s. I want to go back to Heartsease Home for a minute. In the aftermath of September 11, Mennonite Disaster Service did a project called the Restoring Hope Project here in New York from 2003 until about, from 2002 until about 2005. Heartsease Home's program, because of the way the city funded foster care, needed to morph into something else. So the building was available, and with that building available, the council started to dream about a peace center, which looked very much, as I said, like the bones of the structure that is growing for the Brooklyn Peace Center. We dreamed of having workshops and seminars there, of having an MCC thrift shop there, of having it be a vibrant center of peace training, of peace witness. That didn't happen because there wasn't money available, and the board of Heartsease Home decided to open that program instead as an outreach of the Bowery Mission, Christian Herald's Bowery Mission work, and it continues in that way to this day. It was a disappointment for the council because we really were dreaming about a space like that and really wanting to make it happen. In the meantime, Groundswell, an organization project that Addie Banks started out of King of Glory Tabernacle, was developing around that time, and they would have been a really good vehicle for doing peace and conflict resolution. That wasn't what happened at that point, but Groundswell, again, is a potential partner ministry to come under the umbrella of this new venture in Brooklyn. So that's basically the history of the churches in New York, and you can see the continuity between our history and the shifts in our history, our evolution, that call us into this new area with the Peace Center in Brooklyn. It's very much a part of who we've become and who we've been, and part of being a witness to the power of reconciliation and transformation here in the city.
Thank you, Ruth. Wonderful story. Yeah, we're recording here, but if we could have it in writing, that would be very nice to write a few stories on the history of these churches.
Here are my notes.
Very nice. That's great. Yes, okay. I like it when you say, like, if you want to do international ministries, come to New York. Yeah. That's the reality of many of our cities in the US. Now we're going to hear from Jason. Jason is a pastor, what we call planter or missioner, with his wife. Jason, your time, please.
Thank you, Mauricio, and thank you, Ruth, for just a wonderful history. It's inspired me. And it really helps to understand that this is not a new work, but this is a continuation of the movement of the Holy Spirit through Peace Christians in New York City. I want to share just a little bit of a very short PowerPoint. These are things that we've been developing, even just some design work. This is a logo that a friend mocked up for us, and the dove in this is from Picasso, and it's kind of a nod to the international peace work. And he shared that in his design, the 3 dots represent the Trinity. So it's pretty subtle, but it's there. The mission, or at least the working mission statement that we're using, because like Mauricio shared, this is all a work in progress. There's a lot of nuts and bolts and different things to develop, documents to get this off the ground. And for the Brooklyn Peace Center, the mission, the working mission, is that it is an asset-based, which means we're looking at the strengths of the community, and that's what we're focusing on first. It's an asset-based community organization that aims to promote and embody peace, and dare I say at times agitate for peace, in Brooklyn and beyond by equipping community residents with the necessary resources, tools, and opportunities to become peace builders. This is a working statement. Community residents are always prioritized. The immediate geographic context is important to focus on, but it'll also be a resource to the whole city, and might as well dream big, the whole world. And the little asterisk we have says that the Brooklyn Peace Center is 501c3 underneath the auspices of the Radical Living organization currently. And it's a collaborative project of Mennonite Mission Network, the Atlantic Coast Conference of the Mennonite Church USA, and Brooklyn residents. Maybe I can share a little bit about myself and my wife, who is not with me this evening. She's in another part of the house, and then continue. So I've lived in New York City for a little more than 15 years now, getting closer to 20. And my wife, she grew up here. She moved here from Guyana in South America in the mid-1980s, and she's lived in this community in Bedford-Stuyvesant much of that time, not all of it, but much of it. And when we first met, we weren't really even Christians. I'd come to faith in my aunt and uncle's mission in India when I was 19, but I fell away quickly when I came to the United States. And part of it was because the God and country theology that was thrust upon me didn't resonate well. But Jesus's teachings and the movement of the Spirit continued to move in my life. And after a series of different events, I found myself living in Brooklyn, New York. And I came to a place where faith was of central importance for me. And it wasn't long after that that my then girlfriend, now wife, also started having encounters with God and just seeking to walk with Jesus in a very genuine and real way. And so we began attending a big mega church and enjoyed that for a season, but we kind of plateaued. We weren't able to deepen in our relationships with others or even grasp a deeper theology. So we began searching, and we opened our home. That's what we decided to do. We were married and we had extra space in our home, and we began to invite Christians to move in with us. And this was the first inkling of Radical Living Christian community. And it grew to several dozen people living in a 1-block radius, really just trying to love your neighbor, not proselytizing, but sharing meals and potlucks and sometimes organizing with local organizations, finding what it means to submit to the local leadership that's already in place and to learn from them. It was a real growing time for me personally. And it was around that I got my first job in ministry. And that was up in the Bronx, not too far from where Ruth lives, but this was more the South Bronx. And I worked at Youth Ministries for Peace and Justice, which is a small youth organization that equips young people to make change in their communities. A lot of work around immigrant rights and environmental justice. And long story short, I worked there for several years and was invited to join the Bowery Mission, which Ruth mentioned earlier. And I've been there for almost 10 years now, various roles, Director of Compassionate Care and Director of the Chapel have been the hats I've worn most, providing pastoral care to the chronically homeless community. And then about 2.5 years ago, Manhattan Mennonite Fellowship began a pastoral search, and Manhattan Mennonite Fellowship always resonated deeply with me the few times that I had visited. And I'd even told my wife once, if there was a church in New York City that I would love to serve at. It would be MMF. And by God's grace, I was given that opportunity. And it's just a flourishing little Mennonite church in the heart of Manhattan. And I want to say thank you for Sylvia being here tonight and her support. And she is part of this leadership team as well. And she was the previous pastor at Manhattan Mennonite Fellowship for more than 10 years. So another little bit of background for me is that I graduated Union Theological Seminary a few years ago, the Master of Divinity, and I'm now completing my Doctor of Ministry at Boston University School of Theology. My wife, she leads the Radical Living youth program that we do during the summer. And that works with young people to equip them to become change agents in their communities. And when Mauricio and Sylvia first presented the prospect of what is happening at 23 Marcus Garvey Boulevard and that there are possibilities to do ministry there, we were very excited and enthusiastic for this possibility. It just, in many ways, it felt quite ordained because it's a mile away from where we live. We can walk there in 10 minutes. It's just a wonderful opportunity to do ministry in Brooklyn, in the community, and to bring a lot of resources together. So going back to the little PowerPoint, as Ruth was saying, since 1958 or perhaps 1959, there's been a peace witness at 23 Marcus Garvey Boulevard. Primera Iglesia Mennonita de Brooklyn met there for decades, for 60 years, doing this work. So in many ways, we are building upon multiple legacies and multiple witnesses that are coming together in this time, in this space. Hopefully it's like a Kairos moment and everything is emerging together to birth this new center. Current ministries, when I say current, really not that much is happening right now, but surprisingly, quite a bit of stuff is happening, even though we're suffering due to this COVID crisis. New York Mennonite Immigration Program provides free legal services to immigrants. When we weren't under our current situation, it was 3 times a week at least. And we, Radical Living, the youth program, was also about to hold an office there and begin to do the work of organizing for environmental justice and doing youth programming with the children in that community as well. In that neighborhood, it is directly across from Woodhull Hospital, which is a large public hospital, and the Tompkins projects. There's a number of large housing project developments right nearby with a lot of young people, a lot of children and youth. So there's a lot of opportunity to be a support and to be a resource in that neighborhood. Other opportunities that are already being built include the MCC thrift store, which I see Hyacinth Stevens is here, and she's helping to coordinate all the energy around that and to see who has the energy to move this forward. So this center would also have a thrift store. Until we found ourselves in the current situation, I was in conversation with Union Theological Seminary and Eastern Mennonite University to bring training, graduate level accredited training and coursework in August and September for whoever would like to participate in classes in conflict transformation, conflict resolution, and peace building. So there was a lot of energy, and we're continuing to build momentum and build energy, but it's a little bit more challenging right now to do some of this work because we can't be together. We can't be in a physical space. One thing that we did quite recently, we partnered with Common Humanity, which is a nonprofit in the city that works with artists from Syria, Iraq, and other places. We are going to have gallery exhibit in the Peace Center to promote this with some of the artists and others. But because we weren't able to meet together, we had a virtual Zoom online tour of the gallery. Another project that we're doing right now for the Peace Center is the Teaching Peace series, which meets every Tuesday at 5 o'clock in a Zoom room. Last Tuesday, Glenn Guyton was our first guest, and Eddie Banks and we interview folks about the work of peace building. Tomorrow is our second meeting, and we'll have Stanley Hauerwas, the esteemed ethicist and theologian, will be joining us. And these are free and open events. And the Peace Center and the Peace Church, it's really all about collaboration. It's about sharing resources and building together. The Peace Center is an umbrella for a number of organizations, and then it's also under the umbrella or partners with different organizations as well. For example, the Teaching Peace series, the main host of it is the New York City Council of Mennonite Churches through the Education Committee, and then Groundswell and Brooklyn Peace Center are coming together to build this project. Initially, we were going to launch the Brooklyn Peace Church on Pentecost Sunday on May 31st. And there's a lot of excitement and movement toward that. And unfortunately, we will not be able to launch it then, but we were meeting, I believe it was last week, some of the church planners, Kayla and Kate and Greg, who I see who is here, and thank you for being here. And we discerned that in some ways this might be a gift to kind of slow down and develop some of the core documents, and then we can just kind of roll out. So we receive it as a gift, but there's a lot of work to do, and I'm just thankful that we have a space to do this. So thank you, Mauricio, thank you, Ruth, and thank you, Leonard, for the wisdom that you're pouring into this. But I think I'm in time, so I would like to pass.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. Yeah, very challenging time to planting a peace church and a peace center, but hopefully we will get there. And now Leonard, now he's been part of the leadership team since August. Very helpful, very really useful, all his knowledge and experiential learning on how to develop a ministry like this in New York from his previous experiences in ministry as a pastor, now as a financial consultant. So Leonard, your time now to share the challenges of replanting a church in Brooklyn.
Sure, thank you for the opportunity. Anytime I get to, Ruth knows this, Hyson knows this, Pastor Hyson knows that anytime I get the chance to get to New York or hang out with my New York brothers and sisters, I'll take an opportunity as well. For those who don't know, my home is Philadelphia, and that's where I pastored for 20 years and also started a nonprofit utilizing commercial space in order to create some will call social entrepreneurial or social entrepreneurial models. So others will call it sustainable models. There's a lot of different names for it. I call it kingdom, but there's a lot of names with it. And so in my little, what I'm going to be sharing with you is probably the things that we did right. I don't have enough time because I only have 10 minutes to share so much more in which we learned from our mistakes. But I'm just going to share around some best practices. This is specifically, and Jason didn't tell me he was going to do a PowerPoint. Now I feel, and Ruth and Jason and Mauricio wore collars, and now I feel underdressed, but I'm not going to take that personally. But I'm going to share more best practices, and this is specifically around utilization of more of space for a congregation that more than just Sunday morning. So this conversation in my role is more about congregations or faith communities or nonprofits that are looking at what are some best practices in maximizing additional space and utilizing that Monday through Saturday, more so than just Sunday. So, and the reason for me walking in this, I was a banker before I was a pastor, is, as Ruth mentioned, many of the Mennonite diaspora in urban settings are in what could be called historical, underserved, under-resourced communities. And so one of the challenges in that type of ministry is, how do you, beyond outside resources, which was a model 40s, 50s, 60s, how do you maintain, let alone thrive from a financial standpoint in communities where historically the population group are not going to be able to tithe at a level to maintain that particular facility? And so for me, that was the issue in Philadelphia. And so we began to say, how could we create another stream of revenue, another stream of income outside of tithes and offerings? And that kind of led me down this path. And so we purchased a large facility that was close to us. The Brooklyn piece is somewhat of a smaller facility, but I still think these practices would be helpful. So the first thing is that I've been recommending to the Brooklyn piece is something that we really don't think about a lot of when we're entering into this type of mission opportunity, is how do we have the plumbing or the internal structure and systems in place that will allow us to do the mission. We talk a lot about community assessments, which is needed, which the Brooklyn piece has done. We sometimes talk about congregational assessment, which is kind of an internal look at the skills and the gifts within the church. But there are also some other assessments that that need to be looked at within your congregation. Your governance structure assessment. In other words, is your current governance appropriate for what you're looking to do? Financial assessment, taking a look at not how much, quote, money you have, but are your systems in place with whatever you have? Are they transferable that an outside eyes could look in and understand your cash flow, your income statement, or your balance sheet? And some of you may say, well, there's not much there. Well, with whatever we have, there's a certain level of professionalism that needs to come with that. And then lastly is space assessment. How do you utilize that space that you're going to have in multiple ways, not only to, quote, create revenue streams, but also so that you can be a good steward of your space? How can you have a Sunday morning space that can convert into something throughout the week, Monday through Saturday, are the type of questions. And then where are the dead spaces in your facility that need to be looked at, because perhaps they could be utilized in ways that can either, one, generate income or allow you to strengthen your mission. Some other best practices that I've been working or sharing along the way is taking a look at your governance structure. One of the things I recommended to Brooklyn Peace and the team is separating the church internal structure, which works well for the church, from a structure or a nonprofit 501c3 that would hold the mission and then also hold managing the facility in a way that we could be a good steward. And many times I've seen the model where you mix the church and running the building all into one. And my experience has shown that that's a precarious position, because at times it can suck the life out of the church. And not everyone who's on a church council or elder board or deacon board or however your structure is are really even qualified to manage a facility in a way that could be sustainable financially, but sustainable in the structure itself. And so setting up a nonprofit that specifically would run or hold the mission along with managing the facility would also allow you, perhaps, depending on how your nonprofit would be structured, to bring in professionals say an engineer or an accountant or someone else, either from the community or from networks, that could actually help in the professionalizing or managing the facility in a way that is long-term. Another thing that what that board could do is it would establish a process to manage risk. One of the things that owning a building does is it's risk. And it could be a risk that can create assets, but it can be a risk, as I mentioned, that can also consume. I think Mauricio mentioned it. And so you want to have that board, and you want it within that board, you want to have a risk assessment as part of your analysis quarterly or every twice a year, that is understanding. And for instance, over at Oxford Circle, one of the risk pressures that we looked at is that we wanted our facility at all times had to be at the minimum, I think it was 80% or 85% occupied. That if it fell below that, that was a red flag for us, that some financial stress could be coming our way. Another stress for us test that we put in is that we wanted to have 70% of our tenants, or at least half of our tenants or half of our space to be utilized outside of a nonprofit. In other words, we didn't want all nonprofits in our space, so when a pandemic hits or something like this, many times that hits the nonprofits quicker than, say, a for-profit organization. Now, all of them had to be part of, have a similar mission than us, but we really didn't want to have all Mennonite church-related organizations in our building. The challenge becomes diversifying your risk, is kind of what I'm getting at. You want to hire, ideally, but most nonprofits are not in a position, but at the minimum, consult with professionals. And I know that's hard for us in the church because we have a lot of faith, and anybody that has a laptop that can punch in architectural design, we think we should take that as the standard. I have found that when possible, ideally, it's best to bring in professional accountants, professional engineers, professional architects. Ideally, people of faith, and in our experience at Oxford Circle, they either donated their services because they were shocked that we actually solicited them, or they gave us a dramatic decrease in service. I say that because when you hire someone in the realm of helping you renovate, manage, and maintain a facility, when you hire someone, there's a greater sense of urgency in returning your calls and fulfilling whatever requests that you have had. But if you have a volunteer staff, like someone like myself, because Jason can attest, I've missed maybe, I don't know, 20% of the meetings because I'm volunteer. But those who often are paid they may not be as vision focused, but if there's a particular service that you need, we've always gone, or I've always recommended, how can we bring in professionals? And sometimes it's not people of faith. Our example I would give in Philadelphia was that when we applied for a 501c3, it was through a pro bono large law firm in the city of Philadelphia. The brother happened to be a Jewish brother who loved community service, and he volunteered his time. But because they were a pro bono, they did that for us at a high level for free. And the same thing happened with our lawyer who represented us for some L&I, license and inspection issues. Let me think. Is there anything else I want to say in my brief time? Hire professionals. Use. The last thing I would just say is that another best practice is be creative in your organizational structure. Don't try to be cookie cut. And so what I've been trying to do with Jason and the leadership team here with the Brooklyn Peace is not to say, this is what we did at Oxford Circle, so you should do it this way. Because what may have been a good fit for us there may not be the best fit as it relates to what the Brooklyn Peace Center is seeking to do. So be careful of trying to take what someone else has done, be inspired by it, be encouraged by it, be blessed by it, but also be open to how the Spirit may guide you in creating a structure that will allow you to do the mission. And lastly, I would just say in closing, you know, when pastors say in closing, that means 10 more minutes, but I don't have that. But lastly, I would just say is that we talk a lot about peace as it relates to not only nonviolence, which is awesome, and peace as it relates to being proactive and engaging the community around us. But I think shalom is also this understanding of balance. And one of the things that I think we miss out on in our ministries is that our balance sheets, our financial statements, our structures, they are signs of peace because they allow us to do the mission, right? They allow us, people like Brother Jason and Ruth and myself and others of you who are on this Zoom call to do the mission. If we don't have systems in place that have been prayerfully discerned, it will eventually catch up to our inability to get out and do the mission, to have the resources to do the mission, etc. There's a lot that I forgot, but I wanted to leave time for any questions or clarity that I may have missed.
Thank you, Leonard. What I really like of Leonard leadership in the work we are doing in Brooklyn is that Leonard brings a lot of kind of distilled wisdom from his several roles in his life, and he can bring all this wisdom to us, particularly to church planters that sometimes church planters are big dreamers or tend to spiritualize or kind of diminish many of the structural complexities of our society and our modern world. So this time, maybe if you have any questions or thoughts, this is the open mic. I haven't seen any questions on the chat. Let me see. Okay, if there are not any questions or thoughts, we're going to conclude this time, and I wanted to read something from that has been inspirational for me during this time, words from Jeremiah. By the way, if you want to consult with any of the presenters or contact Mennonite Mission Network on church planting, replanting, feel free to.
Hold on, Mauricio, someone did just shoot up a question.
Yeah, let me see. No, they just say thank you.
No, it says Will Fitzgerald asked a question.
Oh, you can read it? I don't see it.
Yeah, it says it's addressed. It happened to be addressed to me.
Oh, okay.
I'm curious how the money flow from Oxford Circle building to the church. I think he says from the church, but I think he means from the Oxford building to the church. So the way that we had set it up, we set up as I mentioned, a nonprofit. We didn't have a marketing person, so the name is way too long, but Oxford Circle Christian Community Development Association. And so what we set up was we had 6 tenants. We received lease income from that. That lease income, 10% of it went right off the top into an account for the facility, for repairs. The remainder paid our mortgage. And then what was remaining went into a escrow account. At the end of the year, we would take an assessment, the church board and the nonprofit board, and we had an agreement that a certain percentage of the net dollars would be given directly to the church. in different years, depending on the ebb and flow, it was considerable dollars. Often what the church did, though, was they did not take their allotment of the cash proceeds. They donated it back to the nonprofit to be used in the dozen or so different ministries that are still functioning out of the church. But we set up, one thing I didn't say in my presentation is we put it in writing. Too often people of faith think they're always going to be where they're at forever. And the reality is that we all move on at some level. Either the Lord calls us home, the Lord calls us away. We get old, like myself, with the gray, and we need to transition to create space for younger people. And so we put a lot of things in writing so that 3 years after I have left, there are things that I don't take with me in memory. There are things that others can now follow and choose to follow or not. So part of what we had is a MOU between the nonprofit and the church that as it relates to cash distribution based on the dollar amount at the end of the year. I'm not going to get into specifics, but it was split between the church and the nonprofit. Often the church then would put its portion back into the nonprofit. So hopefully that answers Will's question.
Thank you, Leonard. Yeah, Leonard will be a great resource for anyone thinking of church planting and handling many of these questions related to nonprofits, finances, existing buildings, and replanting.
We've been very blessed at the Brooklyn Peace Center to have these resources like Leonard Dow, who's done all of this work before. You know, we can glean that wisdom. And Ruth, who knows the history of the Anabaptist and peace movement in New York City, and Mauricio just kind of holding it all together. So it's huge to have this support network, people you can lean on who will pour into you and say, try this way, and we're flexible. I appreciated what you were saying, Leonard, and it is what you've embodied in our meetings too, is that you make an offering, but there are many ways, and maybe even adapt that or try something completely new. So I'm thankful for this team.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for your time, the presenters. I want to conclude with these words from Jeremiah 29 that he addressed to the ones that were in the Babylonian captivity that went on for 70 years in Babylon. Sometimes it feels like this virus is keeping us in some sort of captivity. I hope not that long. But it says, "For surely I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord, plans for your welfare and not for harm, to give you a future with hope." And I wish that for everybody, and particularly for my brothers and sisters in New York, that many times has been hit in different ways. So I bless you and have a great night. Thank you for joining us.
Amen. Good night, my friends.
Thank you.